Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Broad, Tall and Deep. October 6, 2010. When Ajahn Fuang was teaching people to meditate, they'd get to the point where the breath stopped, with a sense of the breath energy filling the body, all the pores of the skin wide open, and all the breath channels in the body connected. Once you had attained that state, he'd have you stay there for a while to get used to being there, and to get good at maintaining a subtle perception. Then he'd have you focus on the sensation of space. You'd begin to realize that the space you were focusing on had no limitations. When you're focused on the body, things go out to the skin, or maybe just a little bit beyond the skin, to include the energy cocoon around the body. But with space, there are no limits. After you were used to staying with that perception of space, Ajahn Fuang would then have you focus on the awareness of the space, which likewise had no limits. There was just the perception of knowing. Ordinarily, he'd have you wait until your concentration was strong so you could stay with these perceptions, and the mind would have the precision, stability, and strength needed to stay with them for a long period of time. But they're useful perceptions to keep in mind even before you reach that level of strength in your concentration. When the body feels weak, you can remind yourself that there's an awareness that's larger than the body, one whose energy doesn't need to depend on the body. When things in your life seem to be crowding in, you can remember that there's an awareness that's larger than all of those things. Keeping that perception in mind, you can get in touch with that dimension for at least some period of time. And that's helpful in a lot of ways. 1. It helps stir up whatever energy you need just to hang on, to stick with things regardless of how bad they are, either in the body or in the world around you. It also gives you a place to stand where you can simply be aware of whatever comes up. Sometimes things will come up in the meditation, and you won't be sure whether they're good or bad, so you want to be able to step back and say, let's just observe these things for a while. A larger observer is a really good place to go, because it helps remind you that when you're going to watch something, you want to watch it 360 degrees. You want to look all around you, from every angle, especially when something comes up in the mind and you want to see its effects. You want your awareness to be as broad as possible. So it's good to practice with that perception. This is one of the reasons why Ajahn Fuang would have his students chant the divine mantra, because it gets you used to thinking in terms of the properties of the body, along with the properties of space and consciousness. You get more and more familiar with these concepts, and find it easier to stay with your perception of whatever sensations might correspond to space, whatever sense of awareness or aspect of your awareness seems to be large. You can take that as your safe spot. It's a good foundation. The Buddha talks about this enlarged awareness in terms of several dimensions. He talks about making the mind broad and expansive. He talks about making it tall and high. He talks about making it deep. For broad and expansive, he basically talks about two things. One is developing the Brahma Viharas. Limitless goodwill, limitless compassion, limitless empathetic joy, limitless equanimity. He compares these attitudes to a large river. When people say really nasty things to you, you want to develop a sense of goodwill that's as expansive as the river Ganges, that no amount of nastiness can destroy. You want to cherish this goodwill as a mother would her only child, this ability to keep this determination in mind, that you'll always act on goodwill, regardless. When the mind is like the river Ganges, it's imperturbable. Suppose a man came along, saying he was going to get all the water out of the river Ganges, and he took a torch, hoping to burn it all up, to evaporate all the water. As the Buddha says, the man would just wear himself out before all the water was gone. So you want to develop that kind of goodwill, a goodwill that nothing can evaporate away. You want your goodwill not to be dependent on other people's being lovable or nice. When you can do that, it's not a case of you're giving them something they don't deserve. You have to remember that you benefit from your goodwill. You want to make sure that goodwill informs all of your intentions, all of your motivations, so that you don't end up creating a lot of unskillful karma. When we talk about limitless or immeasurable goodwill, it doesn't mean just that there are no outside limits to it, it also means that there are no conditions placed on it. Whenever it's appropriate, that's what you act on. Now, there are also times when you have to develop equanimity. Regardless of how much you might want somebody to be happy, it's not going to happen right away. So you have to develop equanimity around that. But again, that, too, has to be measureless, a quality you develop, so that you can call on it whenever you need it. You also want to make your goodwill as expansive as the earth. Just as when a man comes along and says he's going to try to get all the earth out of earth, and he spits here and there, he urinates here and there, and he digs here and there. But he's never going to come to the end of the great earth, for the great earth is too expansive. In the same way, you want your goodwill to be as expansive as the great earth, something that no amount of urinating or spitting can wash away. The other way in which the Brahma Viharas are like a large river has to do with the image of the lump of salt. The lump of salt stands for any past bad karma you may have. If you can make your mind expansive through the development of limitless goodwill and the rest of the Brahma Viharas, then if the results of any past measurable bad karma come, they hardly even touch the mind, in the same way that a lump of salt thrown into the river wouldn't make the water in the river too salty to drink. You don't want your mind to be the water in a cup, narrow and confined. If all you have is just the water in the cup, then when you put a big lump of salt in it, you can't drink it at all. But this image of expansiveness refers not only to the development of the Brahma Viharas. The water in the river also corresponds. One way of preventing it from being overwhelmed by pleasure is to practice with pleasure. You sometimes hear that strong states of concentration are best avoided because the pleasure is just so seductive that it's going to pull you off the path. But if you don't work with pleasure, how are you going to overcome it? If you just try to avoid it, then when it really hits, you won't have any tools to keep yourself from being overwhelmed by it. So you consciously use the breath to induce pleasurable sensations wherever you can in the body. In the beginning, this will be just in certain areas of the body, certain channels of the body that you can get comfortable, so focus on those. As they become more and more pleasurable and more connected, then further connections will develop, and then more connections and more, until you've got the whole body connected with a sense of ease. You'll come to recognize for yourself the tone that feels easeful throughout the body, and you can go right there. At first it may not be very intense, but if you stick with it, it'll have a chance to grow. But even as it gets more and more intense, you don't want to focus on the ease as your main theme. You want to stay focused on the breath because your attention to the breath is what produces the ease. Let the ease do its work in the body, but don't let yourself get overwhelmed by it or sucked into it. Be determined that you're not going to lose your focus, you're not going to lose your grasp on the breath. That's your practice in learning how not to be overcome by pleasure. A similar principle works with the pain. As you work with the breath, you may encounter painful sensations in the body that even good breathing can't dissolve. But you learn how to not let yourself get fastened on the pain or overwhelmed by the pain. Focus instead on the pleasurable parts of the body. If the whole body seems to be painful, go to the sense of space that surrounds the body, permeating through all the different atoms, and keep your focus there. If you can, consciously erase from the mind any perceptions that tell you there's a limitation to the body, i.e., that the skin is located here, the boundary between the body and the air outside is located there. Just don't pay attention to those particular sensations, or don't interpret those sensations in that way, and you'll find that you've got a large awareness you can back into. The pains will appear within the awareness, but they don't have to overcome it. Those are some of the ways you make the mind expansive. As for making it tall or high, the Buddha compares discernment to going up on a tower and looking down on the world below, seeing all the concerns of human beings as they scurry around. When you're looking at them from way up high, they all seem so small. If you can learn to look at your own everyday concerns in the same way, you've heightened the mind. This is one of the terms they use, adhisitam, which means that you raise the level of the mind. You've got a higher level of pleasure as your standing point. The pleasure of form. Then you look at the pleasure of sensuality and see that it's got lots and lots of drawbacks. You look at your everyday issues concerning this person or that project or whatever, and you see them in the context of the larger scheme of things. The vision the Buddha had of the whole cosmos on the night of his awakening was a way of heightening the mind, and from that heightened perspective understanding the principle of action. When you can see the principle of action as universal, and that whatever happens in your life is part of this larger play of karmic forces, it helps to depersonalize your everyday concerns. This depersonalization is an important aspect to developing discernment. For instance, suppose you're dealing with people who say nasty things. One of the things the Buddha has you tell yourself if you're hearing someone really lashing out at you is, an unpleasant sound has made contact at the ear. We don't usually think in those terms. We usually think, why is that person being so nasty to me? And in doing that, we put ourselves right in a line of fire. Whereas if you can step back and think, an unpleasant sound is making contact at the ear, you've raised the level of your mind. You can look at the nasty words going right beneath you or right past you. You realize that what that person is saying is his or her own karma, not yours. It doesn't have to touch you. The fact that people are saying those things doesn't violate your rights because, after all, they've got a mouth and they can say whatever they want to with it. But you learn how to take yourself out of the line of fire. You can actually feel sorry for those people if they're simply speaking out of greed, aversion, or delusion. If what they have to say is actually true, if you've actually done something wrong, then by lifting your mind to a higher plane, you're in a better position to admit your mistake and to learn from it. So this ability to depersonalize things is what heightens the mind, raises the level of the mind, so you're up on the tower looking down at people on the ground below, or up on a mountain looking down at the people in the valley, seeing your life in a broader perspective. As for deepening the mind, the Buddha usually uses deepening to refer to arahantship, the point where the mind is so deeply rooted that it's like a stone column 16 spans tall, 8 spans buried in the rock of a mountain. As for the 8 spans above ground, no matter how strong the winds come from any of the 8 directions, these are the winds of gain loss, status loss of status, praise criticism, pleasure pain. The stone column doesn't shiver or shake. Sometimes the Buddha would use the image of depth as in the depth of the ocean. The fully awakened mind is unfathomable like the sea. It's so deep you can't measure it, so big you can't measure it. Even though this technically applies to arahantship, you can hold that perception in mind. That you have a property of awareness larger than everything it knows, that goes deeper than everything it knows. It can encompass everything. Hold that image in mind. And that awareness keeps on knowing regardless of whether the body feels strong, weak, sick, whatever. Ajahn Mahabua even advises, at the moment you're about to die and there's pain in the body, that you try to get in touch with that sense of awareness and ask yourself, which is going to disappear first, the pain or the awareness? The pain is going to go first. As long as you can keep that perception in mind, it gives you the strength to deal with a lot of things that otherwise you couldn't bear. You're less likely to be overwhelmed. And as you hold this image of a larger, deeper awareness in mind, it's a lot easier to deal with distractions. Instead of thinking of your mind being here and then zipping over there, getting distracted, you realize the distraction is appearing within this field of your awareness. So it's just a matter of allowing the distraction to dissolve while the awareness remains there, grounded, unaffected, untouched. These are some of the reasons you work on expanding your conscious sense of the body, so that you're sensitive to the whole body as you breathe in, sensitive to the whole body as you breathe out. You try to develop a sense of goodwill that's immeasurable, regardless of what people do. And even though there are times when you have to say no to people, or you have to say things that are displeasing to them, that doesn't mean that your goodwill has shrunk. Because after all, letting people get away with all kinds of nastiness is not being kind to them. You're coming from a larger awareness that's not going to be destroyed by anything, one that can take in the bigger picture and act for the larger good in the long term. That's the perception you want to hold in mind. Even though you haven't yet fully touched that awareness or don't have a really secure hold on it, the simple fact that you can have that concept and revert to it when you need it helps get you over and around a lot of difficulties. So practice thinking about your awareness in these terms. Broad, tall, deep, what the Buddha calls expanded awareness, the expanded mind, Mahagatam Siddham, the heightened mind, Adhisiddham. These are some of the key concepts in the practice, the key concepts in the skills you need to get the mind past suffering. Your gyroscope. January 16, 2010. Bring your awareness to the breath. Think about the breath and then notice where you feel the breath, not just the air coming in and out of the lungs, through the nose, but any place in the body where there's a sensation that corresponds to the breathing. The rise and fall of the abdomen, the rise and fall of the chest, the more subtle feelings you may feel in your neck, your head, your shoulders, your back, your arms and legs. Any place where you clearly notice a sense of energy, be aware of that. And try to establish a sense of balance. What kind of breathing feels right? What kind of breathing is too long? What kind of breathing is too short? What kind of breathing is just right, just long enough, just short enough? The same with deep and shallow, heavy and light, broad and narrow. Experiment to see what brings the breath into balance and brings the mind into balance with the breath, so that you're not clamping down on it too hard and, at the same time, not holding it too loosely. The classic image is of a person holding a baby bird in his hand. If you hold it a little too tight, the bird is going to die. Too loose, and the bird will fly away. So try to bring things into a sense of just right, a sense of balance, and see what you can do to maintain that balance. If things come up in the mind, what can you do not to get swept away by them? You stay right where you are. It's like being in a ship out in the ocean. The waves rise and the waves fall, but if your ship has a good gyroscope, the ship doesn't lose its balance. This principle is important. The practice is not only a matter of what you do while you're sitting here, but also as you take your practice out in the outside world. Because the world has its waves. There's material gain and there's material loss, status, loss of status, praise and criticism, pleasure and pain. These things rise and fall, like waves. And some of them are rogue waves. They come with a huge rise in the water. Sometimes they're more gentle. But sometimes, even gentle waves can knock you over and drown you if you're not careful. So you want to have a sense of a gyroscope inside, something that helps keep you on an even keel. Part of this is just the physical sense of having a good center inside, a center you maintain wherever you go. It might be in the middle of your chest, it might be in your head, any place where you can maintain a sense that the body is here, and your awareness is here, and the awareness isn't too tight. The blood is flowing easily, you're not tensing up around your center. As for whatever sense of ease there is in your center, think of it spreading out from there. Then just try to maintain that sense of center. That's one kind of gyroscope you can carry into your dealings with other people, wherever your encounters are. Try to maintain that physical sense of center as steadily as you can, so you don't get knocked over by the waves of what the other person might be saying, or how you're reacting to that person. Whatever comes up, you try to maintain this balance inside. It's important to maintain this, both for your sake and for the other person's sake. There's another classic image in the canon of two acrobats on the top end of a bamboo pole set vertically into the ground. The question is, should they look after each other or should each look after him or herself? And the answer is that you each look after yourself, maintaining your balance. You can't maintain the other person's balance, but the more steadily you maintain your balance, the easier it is for other people to maintain their balance around you. So think of this physical sense of center where the breath energy is good, and you constantly tend to it as your gyroscope. But you need more than just that. You also need to understand about the ways of the world and the importance of maintaining your state of mind as something solid in the midst of the world. Otherwise, even though you may have some skill in maintaining your physical sense of inner balance, old ideas and old values can come welling up. If you have nothing to fend them off, your gyroscope will get knocked off kilter and you'll get washed away. This is why reflecting on the 8 ways of the world is a helpful practice. What does the world have to offer? Just those 8 things. Material gain, material loss, status, loss of status, praise, criticism, pleasure, pain. That's it. And what is there of any lasting value in any of these things? The only value is if you find a way to do good, say, with your gain or your status, and to learn lessons from your loss. Keep reminding yourself. This is the way the world is. Things come. Things go. When they come and go, remind yourself that they really weren't yours to begin with anyhow. When you go around flaunting your gains, you're like a man going around with borrowed goods, getting his pleasure and sense of self-esteem out of things that belong to other people. But the owners have the right to take their things back at any time. That's the way the world is. Look at your money. It doesn't have your name on it. Even on your credit card, the name of the bank is bigger than your name. It's more important than your name. And the bank can call their credit card back if they want. It's not really yours. So if you're looking for pleasure and satisfaction outside, you're looking in the wrong place, because none of these things really belong to you. Even your own body doesn't really belong to you. You can use it for the time being, but then you have to send it back. In the meantime, while you have it, you want to make the best use of it, so that you can get something of permanent value or lasting value out of it to take with you when you go. So it's not the pleasure of having these things, it's the goodness you do with them. That's what really matters. When you learn to be generous with material things, that becomes a quality of generosity in the mind. When you use your status to help other people, that becomes a quality of compassion. The qualities you develop are the only things that really stay with you, even past death. When you meet with praise and criticism, you can develop the wisdom of looking at what other people say, looking at their intentions, and looking at yourself. After all, sometimes criticism is very useful. As the Buddha once said, if someone points out your faults, you should regard that person as having pointed out a treasure. In other words, if the faults really are genuine faults, you've learned something, because our faults are very hard for us to see. We tend to hide them in places where we know we're not going to look. Only if you see your faults clearly can you work with them and develop good qualities in their place. That's a genuine treasure. And when people praise you, remember it's their way of encouraging you, not just to stay where you are but to get better, to keep on being good. As for pleasure and pain, there are many different kinds of pleasure. You want to learn how to find pleasure that's not intoxicating, that doesn't blur your mind's vision when you look for the real source of pleasure inside. As for pain, the Buddha said this is an excellent way of learning the noble truths. The first noble truth is stress. The stress that comes from craving, the stress that comes from clinging. When you find the mind suffering from pain, you ask yourself, where is the cause of that suffering? It's not so much in the physical pain. It's in the clinging and craving within the mind. That's where you want to look. When you adjust your understanding in this way, then when these waves of the world go up and down, you can learn from both the ups and from the downs. That's when you're safe. And your gyroscope won't get easily knocked off kilter. You'll be able to maintain your balance. So your protection is both the concentration and the discernment working together. This helps you to maintain your sense of balance, so that things that used to knock you over don't knock you over anymore. The waves come past, and they just go past. You stay upright as things go up and as things go down. That's the skill you want to take with you. You can't take the monastery with you. You can't fold it in a little package and take it home, spread it out and surround yourself with it. But you can take the skills you've been developing here. Try to maintain that center as you get up from where you're sitting in meditation, as you walk around, when you go to sleep. Try to stay with that sense of the center until you drift off. When you wake up, that should be your first question. Where is my center? Establish that before anything else, and then think about what you have to do next. The wisdom lies in giving priority to your gyroscope inside, so that none of the waves of the world can knock you off course. Better to give than to consume. August 17, 2011. In the novices' questions, the most interesting question is the very first. What is one? And the answer is, all beings subsist on food. This is what defines us as beings. The fact that we need food to maintain our existence. And for most of us, that's pretty much all our lives. What we consume is the big issue. Years back, there was a TV series, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, and they didn't show any rich and famous people making their own things or showing off things that they had produced themselves. It was all about what they had bought, what they were consuming. Our culture is obsessed with consuming. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons shows a couple sitting in a living room, talking to some friends, and the husband is saying, "Of course, it's had its ups and downs, but by and large Margaret and I have found the consumer experience to be a rewarding one." That's the attitude many of us bring when we come to the Dhamma. We're used to consuming not only things but also experiences. There's a huge industry. The experience industry, where they'll create experiences for you to buy. Remember back a while when they advertised the Ford experience? They weren't selling you Fords, they were selling you the experience of having a Ford. Park rangers talked about maintaining the Yosemite experience or the Zion experience for people to come and consume. So it's understandable that when people come to the meditation, they think of the meditation experience as something they can consume as well. We want the bliss, we want the pleasure, the sense of freedom that we've heard that will come from mindfulness and concentration. But in order to consume those things, we first have to produce them. This is why, when the Buddha starts his teachings on the most basic levels, he starts with generosity. It's the first of the perfections, the first of his teachings in the gradual discourse, when he's leading people step by step up to the Four Noble Truths. He starts with generosity and then moves on to virtue, the rewards of virtue in heaven, then the drawbacks of those rewards, and then finally the value of renunciation. Once the mind can see that renunciation would be a good thing, then it's ready for the Four Noble Truths. In many ways, renunciation is a continuation of the principle of generosity. You learn that you have to give something away or give it up in order to get something of greater value in return. So instead of encouraging us to come to the meditation as consumers, the Buddha encourages us to come as givers. What are you going to give to the practice? Some of the famous Ajahns in Thailand talk about how the practice is one thing clear through. In other words, it starts with one principle and just works out the implications of that principle all the way through to the end. And the one thing is this principle of giving. This is what raises us up beyond and above the level of just being beings that have to consume and feed. Remember, the arahant is someone who is no longer defined by any desire, and so is no longer defined as a being. Because arahants have fully comprehended food, their path can't be traced. Even their consuming of food is a gift. Those who give to the arahant get rewarded many times over. That's why the arahant is the only person who can eat the alms of the countryside and not incur a debt. So the practice is one of giving from the very beginning. All too often we encounter talks about dana as thinly disguised requests for money, which is why some people have a real aversion to the topic. But the Buddha had an etiquette around this. There's a story in the canon of some monks who were building huts. They started getting into a contest with one another as to who could build the nicest hut. They were constantly asking for materials and workmen, and the householders were getting harassed with all the begging and requests. When they'd see a monk, they'd turn away, run away, close the door. As the story says, sometimes in the evening they might see a cow coming in the distance and, assuming that it was a monk, they'd run away. Things got that bad. So the Buddha called the monks together and gave them a series of stories about how people don't like to be begged from. One story told of two hermits, an older brother and a younger brother, living near a river. A naga, a very beautiful naga, would come up out of the river every day and just show itself to the younger brother. This frightened the younger brother, as he had no idea what the naga's intentions were, and who knows what the naga might try to do to him. So he went to the older brother and asked him, "What can I do to keep this naga from coming?" So the older brother said, "Does the naga have anything of value?" The younger brother said, "Yes, he's got a beautiful jewel on his chest." So the older brother said, "Well, the next time you see the naga, ask for the jewel." So the next day the naga came, and as the naga was in front of the younger hermit, the hermit asked for the jewel. So the naga went away. The following day, as the naga was halfway up from the river to the hermit's cave, the hermit asked for the jewel. So the naga went away. And the third day, as soon as the naga came out of the river, the younger hermit asked for the jewel, and the naga said, "Okay, enough. I'm not coming back. You're asking for too much." And then of course, after the naga stopped coming back, the younger brother missed him. It was kind of cool seeing a naga in your meditation like that. But by that time he'd driven him away. So when generosity is presented as part of a begging talk, that's what those Dana talks are. They're begging talks, it's not really welcome. As a result, we miss the meaning of generosity, and we miss a lot of the other aspects of the practice, too, because the practice has to start with generosity. Generosity is not just a matter of giving things. You learn how to give of your time, to give of your energy, to give of your knowledge, and in doing so you're changing your whole relationship to the world around you. You're not just a being who's eating and consuming things and experiences. You're finding that you've got things inside that you can share, things you can give, and there's a sense of wealth that comes with that. If all you're thinking about is consuming, what can I get out of this? What can I get out of that? You're poor. No matter how much you have, you're poor because there's always a big lack. But if you come to every situation with the question, "What can I give?" you're coming from a position of wealth. And you find that you do have reserves of energy and knowledge that you can share, and in sharing you gain a lot in return, a lot with more value. Both generosity and renunciation are forms of trade. There's a passage where a monk says, "I will trade what eyes for the deathless. I'll trade what is limited for unbinding." You're trading up. You can't get the better thing without giving up the lesser thing. When you understand that, you realize that whatever you're doing in the practice, you want to come with the attitude of "What can I give?" If you don't have material things to give, how about your time? How about your energy, your knowledge, your skills? When you're dealing with other people, the question is not so much, "How much are they entertaining me?" or "What can I get out of them?" It's, "What can I give? What can I give to the situation?" There are times, for instance, when there's a lot of tension in the room. Can you give some peace? Can you give some humor? Something to make it better. Virtue is also a gift. As the Buddha said, when you make up your mind not to harm anyone under any circumstances, no killing, no stealing, no illicit sex, no lying, no taking of intoxicants, you're giving limitless protection to all beings. In other words, at the very least, from your quarter, they have nothing to fear. As you give them limitless protection, you gain a share in that limitless protection as well. So virtue, too, is a gift. Meditation is a gift. You have to give your energy, you have to give your attention, to develop your mindfulness. When you're focused on the breath, it's good not to hold anything back. Just think of yourself plunging into the breath and the body, totally. The reward is that you develop an all-around experience of ease and refreshment. If part of you is pulled back, there's a part of you that's not sharing in this, that's not gaining anything of real value. So try to come to the practice with the attitude that it's all about giving. Ultimately, you'll be giving up your greed, aversion, and delusion, giving up even your sense of self or your many senses of self. First you give up your unskillful selves as you develop the skillful ones, but then after you've worked so hard on developing the skillful ones, the Buddha said you've got to give those up, too, for the sake of your long-term welfare and happiness. There's a reward that comes from not hanging on. You're always trading up, but you can't trade up unless you start giving to begin with. Otherwise, if you're just in consuming mode, you're living off your old goodness. One of the Buddha's foremost disciples was a woman Visakha, whose nickname was Megara's mother. It wasn't because she had a son named Megara. Her father was named Megara. The reason she was called his mother was because she saw that he was just living off his old merit. He was just in consuming mode all the time, and she made him realize this. She'd learned the Dhamma from the Buddha, and so she taught him, you're just living off all your old merit, and if you don't create any new goodness, you're going to run out. That was the teaching that convinced him to change his ways. Because she was his teacher, she was called his mother. She had given him the gift of Dhamma. So remember, we're here to go beyond ourselves, to go beyond just being beings that are consuming all the time. We try to redefine ourselves, not by what we eat or what we own or what we consume, but by what we produce, what we can give. Making this switch in the mind changes everything. Difficult patches come up in the meditation and you ask yourself not, why is this so bad? Does this mean I'm a miserable meditator? You say, no, what can I give to this situation so that it doesn't snowball? What resources do I still have? What can I draw on to give to the situation to turn it into a different kind of situation? When things are going well, again, what do you give to make sure that they continue to go well? You don't just sit there slurping up the pleasure and the rapture. You look after them. You give your energy to protect them so that as you get more and more into the giving mood, when you finally do have your taste of the deathless, instead of trying to grab onto it or hold onto it, which places a separation between you and the experience, you give up any clinging you might have around it. That's how you reach the deathless. So in giving up, you're not being left adrift. You're giving up things of lesser value for things of greater value. But remember, the only way you can trade up is to be willing to give something in the first place. Otherwise there's no exchange. Forgiveness. November 2, 2010. Right view comes in many levels. There's mundane right view, which deals mainly with action and the results of action, the principle of rebirth, and the conviction that there are people who know these things from direct knowledge. It's not just a theory. Then there's transcendent right view, which deals more with events in the mind, suffering, its cause, the end of suffering, and the path to its end. Many of us make the mistake of wanting to go straight to the transcendent level. Who wants to muck around in the mundane? Especially when you hear the theory about two levels of truth, that there's just conventional truth, and then there's the real thing, so who wants to get stuck on conventions? But the Buddha never taught that way. He would lead people into transcendent right view by starting with mundane right view. It provides the context for understanding every stage of the practice, because the more refined parts of the practice have to build on the basics. If you can't get the basics right, things are going to get skewed by the time you get to the end. Like the issue of forgiveness. Forgiveness seems to be such a basic human activity that we forget that our ideas about forgiveness are picked up from our culture and our view of what's going on in the world. If you want forgiveness to be a helpful part of the practice, you have to look at how your ideas of forgiveness are tied up with your views about the world. Many of us in the West have a feeling that we've picked up from the culture that there's a plan for everything. The universe had a beginning point, it's going to have an end point, there's a story, and it's going to come to closure. Now there are different ideas about what exactly that story is and where it's headed, but just the idea that there is a beginning point and there is an end point, that there's a purpose to the universe at large. That right there has a big impact on how we think about forgiveness. If there's a beginning point, you can tally up who did what first. How many times you've been wronged, how many times you've wronged the other person, who owes a debt of forgiveness to whom. If the plan for all of this is that we're going to become one loving community, we need to get back on good terms with everybody else. Especially if we're going to be divided into two communities for eternity, those who are on loving terms and those who are not on loving terms. Everyone would want to be on the loving terms side. This is why we believe that forgiveness has to involve learning how to love the person you forgave. Then there's another view about the plan for all of this, which is that each person has his or her own independent inspiration from within, and that we're not in any position to judge anybody else. In a universe like that, forgiveness is inappropriate. How can we judge someone else's behavior? Who are you to decide that you're in a position to forgive somebody else when you can't judge anyone's behavior at all? We see this not only in modern Western culture, but also in the Mahayana. Several years back, a scholar who was working on an early Mahayana text got in touch with me and wanted to know where the principle of not judging others appeared in the Pali Canon, because apparently it's all over the Mahayana. The idea that each bodhisattva has his or her own independent inspiration or path to follow. So no one can judge anyone else's behavior or teachings. I looked around in the canon and I couldn't find it. There is actually a lot about judging people in the Pali Canon, what principles you should use, what principles you shouldn't use, but the idea that you're in no position to judge anybody else does not appear in the Buddha's teachings at all. In other words, you can judge when you've been wronged. Now, you may have some misperceptions about the other person's intentions or about the actual long-term impact of that person's actions, but there are times when you know you've been wronged. So what are you going to do about it? You look at it in terms of the Buddha's mundane right view. He says that this process of wandering on comes from an inconceivable beginning, and there's no way to make sense of it. He never comes down for sure on whether there was a beginning point or not, but either way you simply can't conceive it. It's too far back, it's too bizarre. As for the endpoint, again, he doesn't make any statements about whether there's going to be an endpoint to all this. But his picture of how the universe goes through its cycles is pretty random. You get a lot of people improvising. There's no big plan. There's no one narrative about all this, which means that if you stop to ask yourself that question, who was the first person to do wrong, you or the other person, you don't really know. There's a story of Samdito, who was a famous monk in 19th century Thailand. He was abbot of a monastery right across the river from the Grand Palace. One evening, a young monk came in to complain about how another monk had hit him. Samdito's response was, "Well, you hit him before he hit you." And the young monk said, "No, he came up and just hit me out of nowhere. I didn't do anything to him." And Samdito kept saying, "No, you hit him before." The young monk got really frustrated and went to complain to a monk higher up in the hierarchy, and Samdito had to explain himself. He said, "Well, it must have been in some previous lifetime. The complaining monk hit the other monk first. Of course, that might not have been the first time. It could have been just the latest installment of a long back and forth. So there's an inconceivable beginning and no real closure. Different people decide that they've had enough of the wandering on, and they figure out how to stop, but that doesn't keep the other beings in the universe from continuing to wander on and on. There's no real plan. As one of the chants we recite in the evening says, there's no one in charge. There's no overall narrative. What there is, though, is the question. What kind of karma do you want to create? If the answer is skillful karma, then one of the things you've got to learn how to do is not to get focused on how you've been wronged by other people. You don't want to go around getting revenge, because that just keeps the bad karmic cycle going on and on and on. This is what forgiveness means in the context of mundane right view. You decide that you're not going to hold any danger to that person. You're not going to try to get back at the other person. You'll let the issue go. Whatever unskillfulness has been going on between the two of you, you want it to stop, and it has to stop with you. And that's it. It doesn't mean you have to love the person or go and kiss and make up or anything, because there are some cases where the way you've been wronged is so heavy that it's really hard even to be around the other person, much less to interact. You're not called on to love the person, and there's no forcing of the issue that you have to come to closure, that you have to continue weaving the relationship. You can just leave the frayed ends waving in the air, and you're done with them. Now if you want, you can go for a reconciliation, but that requires the other person's cooperation as well. Both of you have to see that the relationship is worth continuing. But there's no sense that every wrong has to be reconciled, because there are lots of cases where reconciliation is impossible. One side just doesn't want it or won't admit to having done wrong. You see this even in the Vinaya. The Buddha places a heavy emphasis on harmony within the Sangha, but he never advises trying to achieve harmony at the expense of the Dhamma. If someone is advocating a position that's really against the Dhamma, and you can't get the person to change his or her mind, then that's it. The Sangha expels the person. Or if the conflict is between two groups of people, one of them will just leave. If you figure out that the other side's motivation is just too corrupt, then the Buddha says you can't achieve reconciliation in a case like that. You can't achieve harmony. To try to force harmony by pretending that there's no difference or that both sides are okay is against the Vinaya, it's against the Dhamma. So again, there's no master plan that everything's going to have to get resolved in the end. It's up to you to decide exactly where you want to take the relationship. Now, it's for your own good to give forgiveness, and forgiveness is something you can give from your side alone, regardless of whether the other person accepts your forgiveness or even thinks that he or she did something wrong that merits forgiving. But for the sake of your own training of the mind, for the sake of gaining freedom, you have to forgive. You don't want to pose a danger to anybody, yourself or the other person. You don't want to get back, for it will force you to keep coming back. As for being forgiven, you have to accept there are times when people will not forgive you for something you've done, but that doesn't mean that what you did was so awful that nobody could ever forgive you. Again, it's the other person's individual choice. As the Buddha once said, there are two kinds of fools. 1. The fool who never admits having done wrong, and 2. The fool who, when presented with a righteous and sincere apology, refuses to accept it. Now, a sincere apology means not only that you really are sorry, but that you're also sincere about trying not to do that again in the future, whatever it was. Some people are wise and they'll accept that kind of apology. Other people are foolish. You can't make your happiness depend on trying to get them to forgive you, to overcome their foolishness. So keep that phrase in the back of your mind. There's no one in charge. There's no overall narrative that says everything has to be tied up into nice, neat packages. Not every story has to come to closure. Think of yourself more as an author just tossing out story ideas. If the story gets to the point where it's no longer good, it's not going to go anywhere, so you just throw the story away and start a new story. This is one of the advantages of mundane right view. It allows you to start new stories all the time, stories in which you learn how to develop skillful qualities. However bad your upbringing or however bad you've been behaving in the past or however poorly you've been treated in the past, you overcame the difficulties, you took charge of your life. You realized that whatever happiness was going to be true and lasting was going to have to come from training the mind, giving up any desire to settle old scores, or to go around loving everybody or being loved by everybody. You give those attitudes up. Now you do develop goodwill. Goodwill is not loving kindness. Goodwill is the desire that all beings be happy. In some cases that happiness can be found by continuing a relationship, in other cases you have to say, well, that's it as far as this relationship goes, but may you be happy wherever you go. Like the chant the Buddha gave for wishing goodwill for snakes and scorpions and rats and creeping things. May all beings be happy, whether they have no legs or 2 legs, or 4 legs or many legs, may they meet with good fortune, and may they now go away. There are some cases where a continued relationship is not going to be a good thing for either side. Like the story of Ajahn Fuang with the snake in his room. The snake moved in. I don't know whether it was during the day or the night, and Ajahn Fuang realized he had a snake in the room, but he decided to take it as a test. So he continued living with the snake in his room for 3 days to see how much fear might come up in his mind and whether he really could spread goodwill to snakes. And he was spreading goodwill to the snake all the time. Finally, on the 3rd night, he sat and meditated, and in his mind he addressed a message to the snake, which was basically, we come from different branches of the animal kingdom, like people from different societies. Our language is different, our attitudes, our backgrounds are different. It's very easy to misunderstand each other. I might do something that you would take offense at. It'd be much better if you went someplace else. There are many nice places out there in the forest. And the snake left. Remember that one of those passages in the phrase for goodwill is, may all living beings look after themselves with ease. It's not that you're going to go around to look after everybody else and clean up after them and take care of them and try to please them and always have a close intimate relationship with them. There are some beings, some people, where it's really hard and it's too much to ask. You want to focus instead on your own mind, making sure that you have no ill will for anybody, and that, at the very least, you're harmless in your behavior. When you understand forgiveness in this way, then the practice of forgiveness is a lot easier. And it's a lot more conducive to becoming free. Stubborn clinging. July 26, 2011. The term becoming refers to the mind's habit of taking on an identity in a world of experience. This can refer to our sense of the world outside and our identity within that world, whether it's the social world or the physical world. But world can also refer to worlds in the mind. As you meditate, you're actually taking on a state of becoming. The world here is the world of form. Your sense of the body from within. For the time being, your identity is that you're the person staying with this sense of form. Looking after the breath, making sure your attention stays with the breath, making sure your thoughts stay with the breath, trying to be sensitive to how your thinking has an effect on the breath. You're monitoring this at the same time as you're doing it, creating the sense of concentration inside. Ajahn Lee was once teaching an old scholarly monk in Bangkok how to meditate. At one point the older monk complained. He said, "Wait a minute, we're supposed to be doing away with states of becoming, but when we're meditating it seems like we're creating one." And Ajahn Lee said, "That's precisely what we're doing. We're creating a state of becoming." He went on to say, "It's like having a chicken that gives eggs. You don't just destroy all the eggs. You learn how to eat some of them." He didn't complete the image, but if you want to learn about eggs, you need to eat in order to have the strength to learn. So you have to eat some of the eggs you're studying. But that doesn't deprive you of eggs to study, because in eating the eggs, you have to cook them first, and in cooking them you learn a lot about eggs. So as you're meditating on the breath, you've got good eggs to eat. The mind has lots of other ways of eating that you don't want to get involved with right now. Every state of becoming has to depend on clinging, and the Buddha's word for clinging upadana is the same word for taking sustenance or feeding on things. So every state of becoming has to be based either on feeding on views, feeding on habits and practices, or feeding on your sense of yourself. Some states of becoming feed on sensual desires. Your fascination with thinking about sensual plans, those worlds you create in your mind around the sensual pleasure you want to get from food or people or whatever. That kind of food can be bad for you. So as we develop a state of concentration here in the mind, we're training the mind to feed in a better way. You notice as you go through life that the more skills you have, the wider the range of different senses of self you can develop around those skills. You have an enlarged sense of what you can manipulate, what you control. And if one set of skills doesn't help in a situation, you can try another. Mastering concentration gives you a new range in which to move and exert control, which is really liberating because so often we get tied up in our unskillful, unhealthy worlds. States of becoming where we're clinging to unhealthy views of who we are or what the world should be like or how things should be done. We can get really tied up in who's right and who's wrong. Some people are so thoroughly enmeshed in their worlds that you wonder if they're ever going to get out. They totally resist any effort to push them out or to lure them out, or to persuade them that where they are is not in their best interest. You've also got characters like that in your own head. Certain identities you take on in certain situations, especially when you feel you've been wronged. The part of you that feels wronged wants to have justice served. You don't like to hear the idea that maybe you're the one who caused the problem. Or even if the other person really is wrong, the fact that you're suffering here can't totally be blamed on the other person. Sometimes you try to talk to that mind state about letting go and not carrying on with that particular fight, and it will really resist. That sense of having been wronged is probably one of our strongest manifestations of our sense of self. Even though you're banging your head against the wall, if someone then tells you, you really don't need to bang your head against the wall, there's a strong part that resists. It defines itself by the pain it's creating. And if it stops, it's afraid it'll be annihilated. This is when you have to gather the different members of your committee around to show that there are alternative ways of living in this world, ways that don't involve so much frustration and pain. That's one of the reasons why we develop the skill of bringing this new member to the committee. The member that's good at getting the mind into concentration and keeping it there with a sense of well-being, a sense of fullness and rapture, refreshment, a very gratifying sense of serenity. This gives you an alternative place to stay. It gives you a new identity to take on as you try to deal with the more stubborn and heedless members that have been bullying the rest of the committee for so long. Now, this doesn't mean that once the mind gets a good state of concentration like this, it's going to automatically slip out of its unhealthy states. That's where discernment has to come in. This is why the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, why he began the path with the Four Noble Truths, pointing out first that our clinging is suffering. This is the essence of all the mind sufferings. It's ways of clinging to the five aggregates. The recognition of this suffering, the stress, the pain you're causing yourself, and the recognition that it's not necessary. Those are the only things that are going to get you out of those really stubborn mind states. That and respect for the teaching. There are times when these mind states are so stubborn that they won't listen to anybody. When that's the case, it helps if someplace in the mind there's a seed of the attitude that maybe the Buddha really did know what he was talking about, and maybe settling scores in the world is not what life is about, and maybe feeding on the injustices that you suffered is a really miserable way of feeding. Maybe there's something better. When you have respect for that attitude, respect for that possibility, that's when you have an out. So one of the duties of discernment is to notice where your stubbornness is. The stubbornness that really likes to hold on to your sensual fantasies, your sexual fantasies, lust, whatever, for people, for things, food, or your very strong views about what's right and wrong, your strong views of the right way of doing things. It has to be done this way, it can't be done any other way, or your strong views of who you are, and when you feel you've been wronged. You've got to learn how to ferret out that stubbornness and see how to get around it by noticing the suffering inherent in that kind of clinging. To have respect for the Buddha's teachings is a big help. The Buddha recognized that this is an important part of teaching the Dhamma, i.e., of one person teaching another person the Dhamma, and also of you teaching yourself the Dhamma. There has to be an element of respect along with the realization that no matter how right you may be, if there's suffering involved in that rightness, something's wrong. You also need to realize that when you're willing to step back from that sense of rightness, it's not like you're abandoning a fight or foregoing the justice you might feel you deserve. You're doing it because you're suffering and you don't have to. You see people suffering really miserable events, and some of them are scarred for the rest of their lives. They just can't get over that particular sorrow, that particular loss. And yet other people who have suffered the same sort of thing can realize that feeding on that loss is not helping anybody, and so they're able to drop it. Which sort of person do you want to be? If you want to be the second sort, you need to learn how to develop the skills to deal with all the places where the mind is stubborn, holding on to its opinions, holding on to its rightness. Realize that you're the one who's suffering and you're the one causing it. Other people may have created bad outside conditions for you, but you're the one stabbing yourself with them. They've put knives in your path, but you're the one picking them up to injure yourself repeatedly. How much longer do you want to carry it on? So when we talk about respect for the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, it's not just a matter of bowing down. Admittedly, we do a lot of bowing down around here. It's partly to inculcate the attitude that maybe there's somebody who knows more than we do. Respect for the Dhamma means realizing that you don't have to suffer, and it's your choice. Do you want to continue feeding in ways that give rise to suffering? Or do you have respect for the alternative where you don't have to suffer? This requires swallowing some of your pride. But swallowing your pride is a better way of feeding than continuing to feed off your sense of having been wronged. Actually, when you let go of your pride, you don't swallow it. You spit it out. So this is what it always comes down to. Learning to spit out all the unhealthy food you've been gobbling down. Do you still want to keep suffering in your rightness, or have you had enough? When you find parts of the mind that resist the Dhamma, what can you do to soften them up a bit? That's a lot of the practice right there. The concentration helps in softening these things up because you keep reminding yourself, I do have this other skill. I have this place of well-being that doesn't have to depend on settling old scores out there in the world, doesn't have to depend on the world outside at all. And wouldn't I be better off adopting the perspective that comes from taking that as my main center, my main source of food? In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.